different for a lot of us, and not all of us are expert at this type of thing. But anyway, we'll hopefully plough on and do our best. Alison had very kindly agreed to do this presentation for us earlier in the year, and unfortunately we had to cancel that. So she's kindly agreed to do this by webinar for us, which is absolutely fantastic. So on behalf of Nestle, I'd like to welcome Allison Arnott from Ovens Valley Equine. Thanks, Alison.
Thank you. Thanks, Marie. This is the first time that I've done the tech thing with a webinar. So let's hope that it all goes to plan. So I've done this talk before, face to face on parasite management. So we'll move into it. The reason I suppose that this is so topical at the moment is because a lot's changed in the world of the worms. We've had a lot of recent discoveries of resistance to our current wormers, including the mectins, which is a little bit scary because that includes your ivermectin, abamectin, moxidectin. And, you know, that family of worms has served, wormers has served us so well for, for years now. I suppose the fact that we're now seeing worm resistance is a little scary. The other thing, of course, is that there's not a lot of new stuff on the horizon. Unfortunately, recent research hasn't come up with any new anthelmintics that could potentially help in our fight against resistance. So not having a lot on the horizon sort of changed the way we're thinking a little. Anthelmintics, just a flash word for wormers or drenchers. I put that in brackets because it's just, any drug family that we use to kill or treat worms. So what's ended up happening, I suppose, is research has led us, it's done us some good work because it's led us to new findings, though, that's giving us new strategies for management based around our existing anthelmintics, the ones we still have. Even though we are getting resistance, we've got nothing new, so we've got to work with what we've got. These new strategies, they're changing away from blanket worming. And blanket worming, of course, is the process of worming your horse every 3 months or at the change of season. Some people did change of season. And that was done without any surveillance or diagnostics. It was just, every 3 months you worm your horse 4 times a year. And certainly now I think that and a lot of people still are unaware of the fact that we've changed in this regard, that a lot of people are still thinking that's perfectly good worming strategy. But because of the resistance we're seeing, we're moving away from blanket worming, and now what we're doing is performing fecal egg counts and selectively worming only those individuals that require it. I think that's also something else that, latest research is indicating, is that we don't need to worm as in a lot of horses as frequently as we were. So having sort of started on that, I thought, let's do the theory of where this all comes from and, what we have learned in the last couple of years. There's a few concepts that are really important for us to understand before we can talk about the practice. The first is that they've determined that there's got high and low, the concept of high and low egg sheds. And we know now that from research that, if you have a herd of horses, in the same herd, you can have individuals that shed high numbers of worm eggs and others that shed quite low numbers. And they're under exactly the same management, conditions, pasture, and all the rest of it. And so what effectively is at play here is immunity. It plays a huge role in worm burdens that individual has. We're learning that, it's interesting that adult horses rarely display infections with ascarids, which is the roundworms, and they're a real problem in babies and young stock. But adult horses, very rarely do you see an infection. The same with Strongyloides species. Both of those worms, if you tend to see an infection in an adult animal, you've got to wonder a little bit about their immune system and whether they might be immunocompromised. The other thing that's become evident is as horses age into adulthood, their fecal egg counts drop, particularly the strongyles, which is the bloodworms. And you see as they age that their worm burdens decrease. And that, you know, a lot of these adult horses, they drop to quite low levels, and, you know, they stay consistently low for life, which are what we call the low egg shedders. So taking that on board, if, you know, if we have a lot of adult horses that have quite low burdens, who are the high egg shedders? And no surprise there in that foals and juveniles, horses under 4 years and under, they tend to shed high numbers of eggs. And that's obviously because they're probably not as immunocompetent as their adults. The other really interesting fact, and I love this one, is that 20% of adults stay as high shedders. So for some reason we probably don't fully understand, their immune system never really gets on top of their worm burdens, and they continue to be persistently high shedders. So that's both with the large and small varieties of strongyles, which, but the other take-home point from that statement is that means that 80% of our adult horses are actually low shedders. So they control their worm numbers on their own without much help. The other thing that's come out of this is that our high shedders, that's being the foals and juveniles, and our high shedding adults, they probably cause about 80% of pasture contamination. So most of your contamination is coming from these two groups. The 80% of low shedders are only contributing probably about 20% of your pasture contamination. I suppose the other thing we've got to wrap our heads around a little bit is, you know, are zero worm burdens, firstly, are they feasible? Is it possible to have zero worms? And the second thing is, are they actually desirable? I mean, I think we come from a background of thinking that worms are evil, and, you know, we don't want worms. No, you know, every animal that has worms is going to be compromised by them. It's actually not the case. Parasitism is, you know, quite a natural state of livestock. And I think it's becoming evident that it can't really be eradicated. There's always going to be some parasites around. The next point, I suppose, with the desirable side of things, you know, it's been shown with studies recently that horses were really heavily wormed through one season. And then they obviously didn't have many worms. And then the next season they were challenged with worm burdens, with infection. They actually had high rates or high worm burdens and high shedding of eggs. This was compared to horses that were not exposed to high levels of worms this prior season. So, you know, that's interesting in that if we do, you know, if we really worm our horses diligently, we can actually leave them open to infection in the future. And I think that's because, again, we come back to immunity. There's a failure of acquired immunity. They're not recognising the worms for what they are, and their immune system's not doing much about keeping the numbers under control. And the third point, one I get from people, but it's a bit creepy, but it's quite interesting, is that there's now been a link between inflammatory bowel disease in people and lack of pinworms in the intestinal tract. And it would appear that there's some, you know, I mean, I suppose all species have evolved through the ages with worm burdens. And it would appear that there's some sort of relationship with people anyway, that pinworms tend to have an immunomodulatory effect on the bowel, because inflammatory bowel disease is an autoimmune disease, and where their body attacks its own bowel. And, you know, but pinworms seem to actually solve that. And I saw a really gruesome show on this once where they were actually, these people with inflammatory bowel disease, they were giving them cups of pinworm eggs to drink, which I thought at the time was particularly gross. But these people improved. They were able to get off their medication. They weren't suffering the same clinical signs, and their condition improved a lot. So that just could be an example of why, you know, zero worm burden is actually desirable. There's some evidence that maybe no. And this is something that's come into you know, recently we've come to recognise, and it's also, as worm resistance increases, this concept is becoming increasingly important. And that is what they call the refugia. And it just simply refers to, it's a reservoir of susceptible parasites. That's the best way we can put it. it refers to the numbers of individuals who are still susceptible to current worming treatments. And so, we're talking about our strong guiles where ivermectin will still kill them, effectively. We want this population to be as large as possible. It's really important that we have a lot of susceptible worms out there, because those susceptible worms breed with resistant worms, and the outcome of that is a population that's less resistant than it was before. If you've got resistant worms breeding with resistant worms, the offspring are going to be crackers. And certainly our whole control becomes more and more difficult. The classic interval dosing, worming our horses every 3 months. This actually exposes these parasites to frequent and repeated exposure. And this actually decreases our refugia because it eliminates the susceptible population. The only guys who are living are the resistant ones. So the numbers in the environment of resistant worms go up and up. And again, as I said, they will then breed together and our resistance problems get worse. If that's all dampened down by a good number out there who are still susceptible, we're going to prolong the effect, the time frame that we have our current wormers being effective and able to, when we need them, be effective. So I underlined the third point, because by decreasing the number of individuals exposed to anthelmintics, we actually increase the refugia. So if we've got, our 80% of low shedders, we're not worming them that frequently. And so therefore that, the small numbers of eggs that they're passing at least we're hopeful, are more of a susceptible population, and maintaining the susceptible population in the environment and on our farms. So this is the concept behind selective drenching. Only drenching those individuals that need it, and we base that on fecal egg counts. So, determining who have a high worm burden and does need help, otherwise they might get clinical disease, and who have got low worm burdens that they can live with quite happily and don't do anything about those guys. So the fecal egg count, that's our main, diagnostic approach to working out the wood for the trees, or the high shedders from the low shedders. And this all comes down to just counting the number of eggs in the horse's faeces. And we also use it not just to assess which horses need worming, but we're also using it to assess whether our anthelmintics or our wormers are, whether that population of worms on our property is showing any resistance to the wormers that we're using. So it's used for two reasons. The current guidelines indicate that, basically a horse, if they have greater than 200 eggs per gram of feces or manure, then they need worming. Their worm burdens are getting up, where we could start to see some clinical disease in these individuals. And so therefore they do, treatment of them is justified. So I thought we'd do a bit of a quick look at measuring fecal egg counts, because I know a lot of people are really interested in this. I know Landcare was talking about, setting up so that their members could do this procedure, which would be, that would be great. But there's a couple of different ways of going about this. There's the manual counting systems, which, we currently are using here in the clinic. And the most common of that is the McMaster slide counter or system. The pros of the manual counting systems is that they're easy, they're also inexpensive, so they're easily accessible to people to do. The only thing I would say about that inexpensive part is, of course, doing fecal egg counts involves using a microscope. And in my experience, the cheaper the microscope, the harder it is to read fecal egg counts. It's unfortunately the way of it that sometimes with that equipment, the cheaper stuff isn't actually that easy to be diagnostic. That's why, so I've got that, except maybe the microscope as far as inexpensive goes. The cons of the manual systems are that they are time consuming. They take, not for doing a couple is fine, but when you start to do large numbers, it becomes labour intensive. And also there's variability in operating, operator technique. And we'll see that in a minute, because I'll run you through how we do one of these. And, there's places where people can do things slightly differently and may end up with a different result. So consistency amongst one operator is probably good, but not different operators, I think. But the other one is these new generation automated counting systems, which are computer-based. And yeah, no, they have, well, I'll go into the advantages and disadvantages of them later. They're obviously not probably accessible to the general public, but yeah, no, we're lucky enough because we're starting to do a lot of fecal egg counts, because we've shifted from all of the horses coming on farm. A couple of years ago, we just used to blanket worm them like everybody else. And a couple of years ago, I made the decision that we needed to start doing fecal egg counts. And so all of the mares and stock that come in here for breeding now get a fecal egg count, and we only worm them if necessary. And because we're doing large numbers, we've just decided we're going to move over to an automated counting system in the near future, probably for this season. But the McMaster slide counter, how to? Well, it's pretty straightforward. You just 2 grams of fresh manure is accurately weighed, and if you probably can't see, I'm assuming you guys can see my arrow. But there's a little, we've got a little scale here. It's quite a cheap little scale, but accurate down to 2.01 grams. So, you know, we can measure it quite accurately. And that actually says 2 grams on that little dial, but you can't see it. So we measure that, and then it's mixed with fecal flotation solution, which is in this picture over yonder. It's actually just a concentrated salt. Well, sometimes people use sugar. It's a concentrated solution with the idea that the eggs will actually float to the surface in that concentrated solution. So you mix that up. Well, mix it with a spoon. Then we remove the fibrous matter. There's numerous ways you can do this, but we've found that just a little sieve like this is the best way, so that we've left with all that really harsh fibrous matter in there, and then we've got a nice supernatant, I suppose you could call it, of liquid with the eggs in it. And then, you know, you agitate that as you're pulling your pipette up, because you want your eggs to be spread throughout the solution. And so then we pull some solution up with the pipette, and then you fill your chamber, both chambers of the McMaster slide, and then you have to actually leave that to sit for a few minutes. For usually 5 minutes. Longer is fine, but by 5 minutes, the eggs should have risen to the surface on that concentrated solution and be sitting up where you can read them with a microscope. So at least 5 minutes, and then you just don't know whether you saw before. I might just flip back here a minute. Oh, sorry, no, I haven't. He's gone. But anyway, the little the chamber has got little grid lines on it. And you just basically follow the grids up and down and count as many eggs as you can find. Then basically you, once you've counted the eggs, you have to add the egg, like from both grids, you add so you've got a total count of the number of eggs that you saw, and then you have to multiply it by a factor to give you total eggs per gram. Now, the system we have here, we multiply by 50, and that's why I've made that bold and underlined that, because that's actually variable depending on who you get your equipment from and the concentration of the solution you're making. Our system, we multiply by 50, and then that gives you the number of eggs per gram. So this is, you know, one of my young guys that we did the other day, and he's ended up at 550 eggs per gram. So that justified worming, and he got wormed. So he's only rising 2. So being young stock, it's not surprising. I just thought, and these are just some pictures of what you're going to see under the microscope. These strongyles, they're the most common. Like, they're the ones we're looking for. Well, we see them very frequently. And so they're certainly the ones that get up well above 200 eggs per gram on occasions. These guys, these are your roundworm eggs. And I think it's interesting, if you notice, they've got a really large shell, or thick shell, I think, on the outside is a good way of putting it. And so they've got, these, unfortunately, are the roundworms that really give your foals and your young stock a hard time. These are the worms that look like big earthworms. And if you get young horses that have got lots of these in their intestinal tract, you will get blockage colics, and they can get quite crook from them because they're large worms. But the other disconcerting thing about the roundworms is that because of this large, thick shell on them, they live in the environment for a very long time. They are robust. They can put up with cold. They can put up with hot. they can actually stay in urine under moister conditions. They say years they can survive, which is a little bit, you know, disconcerting, because the others, given a good hot summer or some good frosts, probably get desiccated and you know, die fairly readily. On the right is Oxyurus. He's the pinworm. That's how the egg has always got the little notch on the top, like the operculum. And he's quite different to the strongyle eggs because of the operculum on the top, and also in the strongyles you can always see the you know, the mass, the cell mass, inner cell mass, quite clearly. And this guy here, he's a bit unusual because he's actually a tapeworm egg. You don't see these in the manure very often, but you can, and they're called the reverse D for obvious reasons. That's what they look like, a reverse D. And so, or a D shape. So, you know, just if you do see it, well, you know what you're looking at, but there's numerous reasons I'll come to later why you don't see them in the manure very often. The automated fecal egg counters, they work, I suppose, they're fluorescent studies. So the sample is actually exposed to sort of a fluorescent and, you know, fluorescent compound. And as you can see, so we've got round worms and we've got strongyles, and they take up different amounts of fluorescence, and then the reader reads that. And this is the sort of report you get on your screen, where you've got pink circles around the roundworms and green circles around the strongyles, and it gives you like an automated readout. It's pretty fast. It's very fast. These are the pros of this system. It's faster, reportedly more accurate as well. Probably you don't have that that user variability when you're running the test. And the cons are obviously it's more expensive, so it's really only economic if you're performing large numbers of fecal egg counts. So talking about limitations, we've got to be aware that fecal egg counts do not pick up all your parasite burdens. And it's always good to remember this in the back of your head. It's only going to pick up those burdens that are actually actively producing eggs at the time that you test the manure. And examples of infections that are not detected are obviously bots, because here are your bots in the stomach, and they're actually a larval form. As you know, I'm all sure you're well aware, the adult form flies around and gives the horses a hairy, you know, just drives them mad. And then the eggs we see on your horse's legs. So there's no eggs to be seen in the manure. So your horse can actually have quite a large botworm burden, and you won't see anything in your fecal egg count. Tapeworms, we saw that egg a minute ago, that D-shaped egg. Occasionally you'll see them, but tapeworms come in what we call proglottids, and the whole proglottid is passed, and then the eggs come out of the proglottid once it's hit the ground. So that's why you don't very often actually see the eggs in your manure, like when you actually process it for fecal egg count. So because they are still protected in the proglottid, by, you know, as they leave the horse. So they may be an incidental finding, but you can't guarantee that if you don't see any tapeworm eggs in your feces, in your fecal egg count, that the horse doesn't have any. Pinworms are the same. Pinworms, the female worm comes out of the anus and deposits the eggs around the perineum in that sticky white mass, and so your egg's actually going to be there on the perineum. And rarely you might see one in a fecal egg count because you've picked up some contamination. It's picked up an egg on the way out. But at the end of the day, you know, you're not going to see high numbers in your fecal egg counts. Looking under the tail and doing sticky tape, you know, a bit of sticky tape on the skin, pull it off, put it under the microscope. That's how, you know, one of the most effective ways of looking for pinworm eggs. Your encysted small strongyles, all these little red dots here, this is the intestine of a horse, and this is where they are dug into the wall of the intestine, and they are actually have set up home there. These are a larval form of cyathostomes, and so therefore you can have encysted small strongyles in your horse and you will not see anything on fecal egg count. You'll only see on fecal egg count once that larval form has come out and then turned into an adult and is then producing eggs. The problem being the encysted form actually can cause quite severe clinical disease. So single-sex infections is something people don't think about. If you've got all males or all females, you're obviously not going to have any eggs. And the other thing is juvenile infections, which the cyathostones here are a good example of that. And the bots are as well, because they're actually larval forms. They're not the egg-laying adult. The other thing with our fecal egg counts is using them to check for resistance in your population of worms. The current recommendations are that we should actually be doing, oh, sorry about that, guys. It does that occasionally. Oh, hold on. My apologies, people. Now it won't leave me.
Penny here, Alison. I'm assuming you've got a window that's popped up.
Yes, I have.
We can't see it.
Okay. Thank you for that, because I was assuming because it was on my screen everybody could see it.
No, but if it's in your way, you might be able to just drag it off to the side or something, just to...
It doesn't want to. Anything won't do it. Anyway, I'll keep going because I think I can remember what I'm going to say anyway. So with the fecal egg count reduction test, you use this, you just do your fecal egg counts, but what you're doing is you're testing for resistant worms in your population. And so therefore you select 5 to 10 horses if you've got them, where your initial fecal egg count is great, 200 eggs per gram or greater, which is the cutoff, as we know, for treating. So we select those. Now, if you don't have 5 to 10, well, then obviously you've only got a couple of horses. You just get the ones on your farm tested. And then anything that is, requiring worming, you worm them with the wormer that you've been using in the last 12 months, and we'll get to that. And then you retest them 14 days later and see what percentage of worm eggs you've still got. Have you got any? You take your number of eggs prior to worming, you subtract the number of eggs post-worming, you put it all over the top, and at the end of the day, if you haven't had a 95% reduction in your worm egg numbers, you probably have a problem with resistant worms on your farm to that particular drench you're using. So it's time then to rethink. All right, so that's the theory. Like, that's basically the theory we need to understand why things have changed. And so let's go into the practice now. I mean, how do you use all of this knowledge to manage your farm? So our current goals for equine parasite management, the two first ones have been around for a year and a day, and that's to minimise the risk of parasitic disease. Now, this is something else I want to stress, is that we're trying to minimise the risk here of disease, not parasites. And that's the difference, I think. You've got to remember that we're really only getting concerned when we've got worm burdens to the extent where we could see illness or disease in our animals. We want to reduce the infection pressure, so we want to try and minimise the number of eggs going onto the pasture and the number of infective larvae that your horses are being exposed to. And the third one is a new one, because to maintain and prolong the efficacy of existing anthelmintics, and efficacy just means how well it works. If something's efficacious, it works well, and vice versa. So that third one is the one that I suppose has really popped up in recent times with the current understanding that we're seeing problems. Remember going into this that young horses are high shedders and prone to clinical disease as a consequence of that compared to most adults. Okay, so current recommendations for foals birth to 6 months. We say at 2.5 to 3 months, this is the only time you're probably going to blanket worm with the current guidelines. And we drench them with a benzimidazole, which is like fenbendazole is Panacur. Oxfendazole is the active ingredient in a couple of other wormers. But that family of drugs currently, because we've got to remember that it's the roundworms that cause our young stock and our foals serious clinical disease. So we're chasing roundworms. And this family of drugs are still at this stage showing no resistance, or, the roundworms are showing no resistance to this family of drugs. So that's why, and the other reason for blanket worming is because sometimes at this age, we actually don't have eggs in the feces because the whole worm life cycle hasn't got to a stage yet where the worms are being shed. So they might have the worms but no eggs. So we just blanket worm at this age. And then the next time we think about these guys is just prior to weaning, because this is a stressful time for them. So we want to make sure we don't have a high worm burden going into weaning. And at this point in time, we do perform a fecal egg count because we've got eggs being produced now from these worms if they've got them. And we're trying to work out which worms are involved. You know, we only got the young stock, so we could just have a roundworm population, or we could have a mixed roundworm strongyle population. They're the two most common worms we're worried about. There's others in the mix, but not as, you know, at this age that they don't cause the clinical disease that these two do. And so we're wanting to find out what population we're dealing with, and then we choose the most appropriate drench. We'll get to that a little bit later too. Weanlings to 4-year-olds. So this is your young stock, but not foals. The current guidelines are recommended that we do fecal egg counts spring, summer and autumn. So where we used to blanket worm, now we're actually doing our fecal egg counts. We're drenching those that need it. You know, even with young stock, if you're on a clean farm with low stocking rates, you may find that they don't have a problem. And if that's the case, no need to use drench unnecessarily. If you do find your young stock over the 200 grams, 200 eggs per gram, then the choice of drench should be based around the results for yearly fecal egg count reduction. So as we just discussed, if you've done your egg count reduction testing and you know you've had a good reduction which shows that the drenches you're using are still working well, stick with them. That's the current guidelines. The only time when we would make a change to that is the late autumn treatment. At this time of year, we tend to use something that's larvicidal against encysted cyathostomes. Also, it's when we're going after bots, and also probably in young stock tapeworms aren't a big issue, to be quite honest. But this, you know, this autumn worming is when we'd use something like moxidectin or 5-day course of fenbendazole, because both of those will get those encysted cyathostomes. In the late autumn, that's when those guys are living in the wall of the gut, and so that we can get them there at this point in time. Unfortunately, ivermectin does not get the encysted variety, and most of the others don't. It's only those two. Adult horses. So the crux of the matter with adult horses is you've got to use your fecal egg counts to identify your high shedders from your low shedders. Remembering, of course, that adults that are low shedders, or not even low shedders, but adults tend to show this behaviour throughout their life. So if they're a low shedder, they're probably always going to be a low shedder, and if they're a high shedder, they're probably always going to be a high shedder. So how do we manage them? The low egg shedders, which are, remembering, 80% of our adult population on current statistics, we only worm them once a year. And we're doing the same thing with them. We're just doing a strategic worming in late autumn. Now, this is a little bit of it's good to do a fecal egg count here to work out where you're at with these horses to test your high shedder, low shedder. But we're after 3 varieties of worms here in this late autumn drenching that we're not going to pick up with fecal egg counts. And that is the bots, the tapeworms, and the encysted cyathostomes. So regardless of what our fecal egg count says, it'll give us all the information we want about our bloodworms and our roundworms, but we're not going to get information on the others. So we just routinely do these low egg shedders once a year in late autumn, chasing all of those particular worms. And that's for that reason is we use the larvicidal drench, because it's effective against encysted cyathostomes, tapeworm and bots like moxidectin plus praziquantel. It's a good time to use that guy. The high egg shedders we treat as per our young stock, in that we do our fecal egg counts in spring, summer and autumn. And we drench based on the fecal egg count results using the drench that we know is working. And this is a bit of theory, but I thought I'd pop this in here because just to outline what we've just been talking about. This is currently what we're thinking at the moment. So this group here, the panicures and oxfenbendazole, small strongyles, there is increasing resistance to them, which is why when we use fenbendazole, we're using it as a 5-day course. We're not using it just as a single shot. But importantly, roundworms here, at this point in time, there doesn't appear to be any resistance that has been detected to the benzimidazoles. So that takes us back to our foals and why we use this class of drugs for that 2.5 to 3 month old foal when we're drenching them. Parental Marantal, you'll see that in a lot of these. It is never on its own, but it's often a lot of these combo drenches. You know, the Cyathostones are small, strong galls, common resistance, and it's showing early signs of it with the roundworms. This is ivermectin, the macrolides, ivermectin, those guys, early indications here, widespread for the roundworms. This is why we don't use ivermectin in those guys for our 2.5-month and 3-month-old foals, because the only worms we're actually worried about are roundworms. So this is concerning to us, the fact that we, you know, and ivermectin is really starting to lose its efficacy. Now, the other thing I'd like you to see here, the large strong galls. Look at this, none, easily killed. All our current drenches at the moment are still going after them. And these are the large bloodworms. These are the ones that used to cause a lot of clinical colics because they'd cruise through the arteries of the gut and cause parts of the gut to die from blood flow problems. And colic due to parasitism in the old days was really common, and a lot of horses, you know, lost a lot of horses. But since ivermectin and those guys have come along, we hardly see it at all anymore as a clinical disease, which is heartening. But just as an aside, Norway a while back decided, because of they were getting concerned about resistance, that they would stop worming adult horses. They would make it an active veterinary science, and all horses had to have fecal egg counts and could only be drenched by a veterinarian because they were concerned about resistance. And what ended up happening was, after a couple of years, it became evident of not worming these horses, these low shedders. They started to see clinical cases of colic again due to these large strong galls. So even those guys now have gone back to worming once a year, just those low shedders once a year. So then I suppose we have to talk about management strategies that are still recommended, and these are this is non-worming strategies. This is stuff you can do on your farm to reduce your infection pressure. So what we're trying to do by that is we're trying to reduce how many eggs get out there and how many infective larvae there are on our grazing pastures. Interesting, picking up manure from paddocks is still the gold standard. If you do this twice weekly, it is 4 times more effective at reducing pasture contamination than drenching alone. And that's even drenching frequently. That's your frequent use of anthelmintics. So it's, you know, it's hard in a paddock situation. I think yards and stables are really easy. Paddock situation's not as easy. You know, there's better automated systems coming through, picking up out of the paddocks. I don't know, we've just bought a paddock blade. I'll tell you how it goes. We're going to use it this season just to clean up the paddocks. You know, there's vacuums, big vacuums. They, unfortunately, I think, they tend to break down from what I've been told. But anyway, if you can do it, it is best. Rotational grazing is still good. You know, these things have been recommended for a long time, and what I suppose all I'm saying here is that they're still good. You know, the infective larvae is picked up by that, like whether it be sheep or cattle or whatever, but the life cycle is not completed because the worm's in the wrong host, and so we call it an end stage host because the life cycle doesn't go any further, and you know, and so the egg shedding stops. Avoid overstocking, of course, easier said than done, but greater than 1 to 2 horses per acre. That causes horses, because you know how horses, they have lawns and roughs. With their normal grazing behaviour, they have areas they graze really hard, and they have areas that they leave as roughs, and that's often where they'll manure. That's sort of, you know, they stay away from that when it comes to grazing. And because they're manure areas, they're often very high in infective larvae, those patches, those roughs. What happens in this when you're overstocked is the horses don't have any choice, and particularly those guys on the bottom of the pec order, when you have no choice, well, that's what happens, and they do graze those areas, and so they pick up a lot more infective larvae. However, this is management strategies that we've all thought were good and are no longer recommended and this is what this recent research has brought about, because both of these two things actually reduce our refugia. Remember, that's our population of susceptible worms, and rotating drenches. There's a couple. One, you know, firstly, there's no evidence that exposing parasites to multiple wormers encourages multi-resistance. They haven't found any evidence for that at all. The second one I think is really interesting. There is no evidence that using a single wormer increases parasitic or parasite resistance. So that was always the logic between doing rotational drenching in the past, was that, you know, give the worms a taste of this one this time, and then we'll hit them with that one next time, and, you know, there won't be any resistance because we'll be knocking them out, you know, by hitting them with a drench they haven't been exposed to before. But in actual fact, it does appear that there's no evidence for that. And that's why they're now saying you should be using the drenches you use on your property, they should be guided by your resistance testing, your reduction, you know, when you do your testing for resistance. If you find that the worm that you've been using is still quite effective, you use it for the next 12 months. And then when you do your resistance testing again in 12 months' time, you retest it and see how it's going. And if we can get effectiveness out of one wormer for a long period of time, it also takes the heat off the others. So that is something that's changed significantly. The other thing is drenching and moving to new pasture. We always used to do that. It's like drench the horses and then put them out in a new paddock. That's also now gone out of vogue, because by doing that effectively, we are decreasing our refugia, because when you drench a horse, obviously all the susceptible worms get killed. If there are any resistant worms in that gut, they will live, and then you put them on the fresh pasture, and all the worms, all the eggs that come out of those horses going onto that fresh pasture are going to be the resistant variety. So they've got nobody else to breed with there. They're just going to be resistant, and resistant are going to breed together. And as I said, they're going to make super resistant offspring. So there is now talk that you should worm your horses, leave them on the same pasture for a couple of weeks, and then move them to give them a chance to sort of like, I know that sounds a bit bizarre, and I think it's still a little bit grey, but certainly this whole idea of worm and then move is out. And that is the end of my discussion. So I don't know whether, I think there may be some time for some questions or a chat. I'm not sure who's going to moderate that. I think Penny might be going to.
Joy, did you have a question? Oh, from Karen. So does harrowing your paddock help?
Yeah, it's a good question, because I was going to put harrowing is something that is also become a little bit controversial, but I think the main thing we always have to remember about harrowing is that you are mixing the lawns and the roughs, which I spoke about a minute ago. When you harrow, you're breaking up the poo. There's no doubt about that, which exposes the eggs and the larvae to the environment, hopefully desiccates them. But you are also dragging that poo all over the paddock. So you're now contaminating the low areas of the lawns with the poo from the higher, the roughs. And so the current advice is, yes, harrowing is helpful, but not while horses are grazing it. They're saying that you should harrow and then rest the paddock. And particularly if you can harrow at a time where that paddock's going to be, and how long is that for? That's a really tricky question, because it depends on your environmental conditions. So if you can do it at a time when, before like a heat wave or even a really cold snap, it's going to help to desiccate and, expose them to the environment, well then, you do it then, and that's fine. But I think that it's now been questioned in horses that are still, in paddocks that are still being currently grazed. You are way, way better off to pick up the poo, not spread it around.
Thank you. Next we have one from Joy. Where in the poo pile do we take the sample from?
It doesn't matter. The theory is that the eggs are pretty much spread throughout the faeces. The one thing I will say about that is it needs to be a fresh sample. We like to have it for a fecal egg count within 4 to 6 hours. If you can't do that, you can refrigerate it. If you can keep it in the cold, it lasts longer. And if you can do that overnight, probably one night, like 12, maybe 18 hours is okay. But as far as where in the poo pile, my advice would always be, I don't think it matters where, but maybe from a couple of different places. But in theory, the egg burden should be throughout the manure.
Well, I think that answered some of Joy's second question as well. But she also was wondering, where could she obtain a guide for worm egg identification? So is there a...
Yeah, there's numerous references around. I think, actually, to be quite honest, I hate to say this, but Dr. Google's probably as good as anything, because if you actually Google worm egg or parasite equine, always put equine parasite eggs, there's lots of images. There's some great images there, and telling you which is what. I've got, I do actually have a parasite text, which I've got some of the images from. So yeah, it's just, I'm happy to pass that on if she'd like, but I don't have it with me at the moment. I can't remember the author. But yeah, I really, if you're just after good quality images of eggs, like how they look under the microscope, they are on the internet.
Yep. Kerry has a good question here. Interesting. Is there possibly a way to increase the immunity of your high-shedding horses?
Not to my knowledge. I don't know that there's been any work done on that specifically with regards to high and low shedding. I think, I don't know that just because they're a high shedder means that they have got a poor immune system or they're going to be more susceptible to other illness or disease. I don't think that there's been any work proving that that's a point. I think it's just simply that for some reason in those individuals, they're not recognising the parasites and creating the antibodies and the the acquired immunity against them as effectively as the rest of the population. There's a lot of immune boosters, supposed immune boosters as well. You've got to be very careful out there because there's a lot of claims on products, so there's not actually been any research proving that they're actually effective. But to my knowledge, with regards to the high and low shedding, I haven't seen any work indicating there's anything we can do to change that pattern. Yep. It could come in the future, though. Watch this space, I suppose. This is a very much an evolving area at the moment.
Definitely. And then we have from Karen, is there any relationship between worms and ulcer activity?
There are certain worms that certainly can irritate the bowel. And bots, of course, are the ones that live in the stomach. There's no doubt that they cause erosions. They do cause erosions. I don't think it's a classic ulcer like we associate with the stress and the illness, and that where horses actually get this, ulcers in there's two areas of the gut, and those ones are specifically in the non-squamous area, but there is no doubt that high worm burdens do cause irritation and ulceration in the gut. The difference would be there, I feel, that once you've got rid of the worms, I think in those cases there's probably, it's going to heal, other than the stress-related ulcer situation, colonic ulcers and stuff we see from too much anti-inflammatories, foregut ulcers that we see, and we still think there's an element of stress and illness involved with those, where those horses with those sorts of ulcerative disease are always prone to it, and if you give them the right conditions, they'll flare up again. Where I think the ulceration caused by your worms is a traumatic lesion that once the worms stopped having their nibble, is probably going to resolve.
Yep. Any last questions from anyone out there?
Penny, there's some questions on chat that you might be able to pick up. So one of those is, what is the cost of a fecal egg count?
Fecal egg counts are pretty, at the moment we're charging $32 for a fecal egg count. So, it's not overly expensive given the fact that you can save yourself, if you can identify your low shedding adults, you're saving yourself considerable amount in drench as well. So, and I plan to leave it there at the moment. As I said, we're getting the automated counter in, but that wasn't it's not going to raise the price. It's just simply going to make getting these samples through faster and more accurately.
Yep. From Tessa, we have how hot or cold does it need to be to expose eggs, and how long is it recommended to rest a paddock following harrowing, if you follow that practice?
Yeah, and that's why I said there's actually, the problem is it depends on your environmental conditions. Look, I think if you're in if you're getting 40-degree days, that's going to knock a lot of the strong goals around. Absolutely, and probably you don't need too much time. But the roundworms, if you've got roundworms on your farm, as I said earlier, those hard shells on those roundworms, they have proven that those guys can exist for years in your paddock and still be infective. So they are, they're a nasty egg. And the other thing about this is moisture. And I'm probably being a little bit evasive here because I don't think I can give black and white answers on this. Dry conditions certainly causing the larvae and the eggs to desiccate a lot faster than if you've got moisture. If they can hide in moisture, they will live longer, which is hence the reason that harrowing was always advocated, because living in that moist pat certainly allows them to survive longer. But at the end of the day, the infective larvae, once those eggs hatch, the infective larvae actually have to crawl up onto the grass stems so they can get grazed again. They don't stay in the pile. So that they need to make themselves available for being ingested again. And so, hot conditions can certainly knock them around. It takes cold, it has to be pretty severely cold. They do like cooler, moist conditions. And in some cases they're, sometimes months. I always, I'm lucky here in that we can rest our paddocks through the winter because they get trashed in the spring and summer. And I'm usually fairly happy that having no horses on most of the paddocks through the winter is going to mean they're pretty clean by the time we start in the grazing season in the spring through that cold time. But, sometimes it's lengthy periods of time and that's difficult.
Yep. So sort of to follow on from this, Kay has asked, are irrigated pastures more conducive to egg survival?
Yeah, moisture. Again, back to the moisture thing. I think wherever you've got moisture, they certainly can survive better. The pasture forms of your worms are going to do better when there's moisture in the grass and on the ground.
Yep. Audra's asked how to manage poo and feed your dung beetles at the same time.
Yeah, good question. And of course, we all know that the mectins are, they're pretty hard on the dung beetles. I think the best thing you can do if you're really, happy with your dung beetle population is pick your poo up and and then put it somewhere where your dung beetles can have fun out of your grazing areas. But the other thing too, I'll say about the low shedders, and I'm no expert on, I know that there's the two sorts of dung beetles and they have actually quite slightly different breeding cycles. But I'm pretty sure that late autumn worm, when we're going after, and at that point we're recommending you use moxidectin, which isn't very friendly to dung beetles, but I think it's getting pretty late for a lot of dung beetles in their breeding cycle. But don't quote me on that, I'm not a dung beetle expert.
No worries.
I don't know whether I answered that one.
That's okay. Maybe
it's a bit of a fine balance.
Yeah.
As I said, picking up your poo is the best thing you can do.
Yep. Maybe it's something that the group could look into in the future. Another question here from Helen. Neck threadworms, not much is known about these, so can you expand?
That's Onchocerca, I presume you're talking about. The fellow that lives in the nuchal ligament in the neck. It's actually not, the adult worm lives in the nuchal ligament in the neck, and then the larvae come out and travel around the body and end up subcutaneously, which cause the horses to get low-line itching. Again, it's a worm that we're not going to see in fecal egg counts because the eggs never end up in in fact, this particular worm doesn't end up much in the gut at all. It ends up, the larval forms go into the low line of the horse so that they can be picked up by insect vectors from memory and spread that way. And the problem is that the disease we see with them scratching and itching is it's actually a an immune response to the larval forms in layers of the skin. And not all horses get it. So therefore you can have onchocerca in the horse without actually seeing clinical signs of the adults in the nuchal ligament. But ivermectin is pretty effective at getting, at killing onchocerca. And certainly it's something we always do is worm a horse if we've got low line itching, chasing that particular guy. But we're not going to see any part of that life cycle. In a fecal egg count, you're not going to detect them.
That's right, thank you.
That's if that's the neck.
Yep.
Yeah.
So a question here, where can you purchase testing kits from? So
well, I think like there's a couple of mobs. I know there's and this is could be a good question for Marie, actually. Sorry, Marie. Because Landcare had a contacts with a crew in South Australia who was sending out kits, and you could send fecal samples back, to have the McMaster slide counter done. But at the end of the day, really, if anywhere, like we do the McMaster counting technique here, and all you've got to do is bring in a poo sample. So just in a container or a glove or something like that. We only need to do the McMaster technique. You only need 2 grams of manure, and it's not much, to be quite honest. It's a pretty small volume. But I don't know whether Marie's got anything to add to that. There was the guys in South Australia. They're a good crew because they've got a lot of resources. They've got kits, they've got books, in fact, there's somewhere else that probably has good literature with pictures of the worms' eggs as well. But if you're thinking about doing it at home, which there's no reason why you can't except for the microscope, if you want to invest in a microscope, it's very easily done.
Marie, are you there?
No, she's on mute, so she mightn't be there.
That's okay. We can follow. Oh, is Alandi, have you got an answer for that for us?
Penny, yeah, I can comment on that. The group does hold some microscopes. They are of a reasonable quality, but perhaps not quite as good as what Alison would have. So we do have microscopes that we are hoping to make available for members of Nestle to be able to do their own fecal egg counts with a little bit of training. And that was meant to be the second part of the program tonight, but unfortunately without being able to meet face-to-face, we weren't able to do that. So that might be a little bit of a watch this space.
Yeah, we did that last time. We actually had the demo and people are allowed, able to process samples and have a look, but not possible over the airwaves, unfortunately.
No, so that's something we're hoping to do in the future.
Can anybody hear me now?
Yeah.
Can Marie?
Yes, I'm unmuted. We did, yes, Alison, we do have a contact for a lady in South Australia who used to run workshops on that, and she's also produced a book, and she put out a whole kit for home testing. And our plan was that we purchased the microscopes and that people could buy their own book and do their own testing with the use of our microscopes. But that's all been put on hold, of course, at the moment. But I think we'd be happy to put that on our website, the lady's contact for the book. It is quite simple to follow, and it does have good diagrams in there, and it's quite a good reference. It explains a lot.
Yeah, no.
All right.
Does anyone else have anything else to add?
I think we're all good, Marie.
Okay. No.
Hopefully we've got through all
Okay.
the questions.
Yes, we got through that okay, I think. Thanks, Alison. That was a great presentation. Under difficult circumstances, it's been hard times for a lot of people, and we thank you for that tonight. It was great. A lot of us aren't used to webinars, but we're getting there. So we'll all be experts by the end of this and our Zoom meetings and all that type of stuff, which is good. So thank you again, Alison, for that. And I'd really like to, if you've joined our conversation tonight and seen our webinar, we try to get things organised through the year, and it has been a hard time for that. But if you are not a member of Nestle, if you'd like to join, It's not very expensive, and the details are on our Facebook page. So if you'd like to have a look at that, you'll be kept up to date with everything. And yeah, so stay safe, everyone. And once again, thanks, Allison.
My pleasure. It's been great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, Allison, it's in your court to sign us all off.
Stop share.
And
Well, I just stop. No, hold on. I'll just stop here, I think. How did that go? Have I chopped you off?
no, we're all
Now we've got the whole screen.